Good afternoon, everybody. We'll just give it a few minutes or a few seconds at least for people to join. It'll be a few minutes before our speakers start into their presentations. So it'll just be me talking for the first minute or two anyway. You're all very welcome. On this sunny afternoon. Delighted you could come along for the third in our series of webinars on the Water Framework Directive. Now, if you haven't been following our series so far, you can go onto our YouTube channel and you can catch up on the presentations that we've had to date. We looked at the overview of the Water Framework Directive, what it is and what it means and why it's probably the most important piece of legislation we have in Ireland dealing with water. And last week we looked at physical modifications, so that's arterial drainage and things like that that alter the shape and function of river systems. And today we're going to talk mainly about the pressures on our rivers and our water bodies. And we have some very expert speakers lined up to talk about that. And in particular, we'll be taking a focus on agriculture and wastewater treatment with some of our speakers. Now, why are we talking about the Water Framework Directive? Well, I'm going to maybe share this slide with you. I can't even find it now. I'll put it up at the end of the webinar, but basically we're talking about the Water Framework Directive because there is a public consultation at the moment on the third cycle of the River Basin Management Plan, which looks like this, and this is on the website, and that consultation closes at the end of March. So we're hoping as many of you as possible can make a submission to that and let the government know what you feel the issues are in your particular area. So without further ado, I think I'll go to our first speaker. So we have Jenny Deakin is the Senior Catchment Scientist with the Environmental Protection Agency. And over to you, Jenny, in your own time. You should be able to share your screen there.
Thanks very much, Pádraig, and thanks for inviting me to take part in the series. It's been great so far. Let me see now if that has shared and if it's in presentation mode, is it?
Yes, we're seeing it and hearing you clearly. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so as you said, today I'm going to talk about the pressures impacting on water quality. I'm going to give a brief overview of the water quality situation first and look at some of the key issues and the trends, and then go into the key pressures with a particular focus on agriculture and urban wastewater, because I know that's the topics that Sinead and Elaine are going to focus on later on. And then I'm just going to wrap up with a few final slides on how to find out more if people are interested in what the water quality of their local stream or river or lake is. I'm not going to dwell on the overview of how we monitor. There was Sinead put forward a lot of very useful slides on that in the first presentation. So I'm going to leap straight into it in terms of the current reporting, our current status of waters. I mean, the headline really is that about half of our surface waters are in good condition and half are not. And when you break that down to each of the different water categories, it's about half of our rivers and half of our lakes are okay. The estuaries fare considerably worse. There's only 38% of those in good condition, but our coastal waters are generally better at about 79%. We also look at chemical status. So that was ecological status, but we look at chemical status separately, and around 75% of our surface waters are in good condition for chemicals. And then finally, looking at groundwater bodies, we also monitor those. Quite a high proportion of those are in good chemical status and also in good quantitative status, which is about groundwater levels. And it really looks at, are we abstracting too much information or too much water for that water resource to be sustainable? So overall, groundwater in good condition, rivers and lakes 50-50, and estuaries are really faring the worst. I should say our next report, which looks at the ecological status, is due later on this year. So this data I'm showing you here is from 2018, which is our last report. We do it every 3 years. So if we pull out some of the key indicators, I mentioned the the rivers and the estuary situation. The map on the left there shows the breakdown of status distributed all around the country and all the water bodies we monitor in. And the 5 colors there, which Sinead explained, the first session relates to the 5 classes of ecological status. So blue and greens are good, and oranges and the browny color, yellows and reds are not so good. So you can see there's quite a wide distribution when we look at ecological status, which brings in all of the different monitoring elements such as nutrients and fish and the physical condition and the biota in the water. So if we move to the middle panel then at the top, this is what's happened with status in rivers over the last number of monitoring cycles back to 2007 and 9. So there are very few bad rivers, and that's good. So the red bars there are very small. The oranges and the yellows, not so good, as we were saying. And you can see that those bars are increasing over time, back over the last decade. And the high status waters are also shrinking, and that's not good either. So you can see there how the trends have changed over time. We've a lot more work to do. Moving down specifically then into the lower of the panels in the middle, the high status waters of specific concern are that we're seeing a decline in the high status waters back over the last 3 decades. They've shrunk now down to about 18% of our waters are in high status condition. And those are really our refuges for the good biodiversity to populate the more degraded rivers downstream. So they're really important to protect. Over on the right-hand side then, these are the 190 areas for action that were flagged in the second cycle plan for targeted action by the local authorities water programme and ASAP and all of the various public bodies to put their efforts into the same areas to prioritise the effort. So when we look at how the river biology has fared over the last 3 years, just the biology now as an indicator, there's been net improvement in those areas for action, which is really positive compared to a general net decline elsewhere, as you can see from all the other slides I've been showing. So there are early signs that this focused effort in the areas for action may be bearing some fruit. So dialing into the data then, what can we see is the drivers or the impacts to waters? And when we pull out all the evidence base, really this chart shows that the key issue in our waters is still excess nutrients. By far the greatest number of water bodies are impacted by excess nutrients. That's the biggest bar. The second bar is the morphology, and you talked about that yet last week in your physical modifications webinar. So I'm not going to dwell so much on that today. I'm really going to hone in on this nutrient issue. So looking at the recent nutrient quality and the trends, if we look at the left panel here first, we look at nitrate. This is a map of all our monitoring stations of nitrate. Again, the same sorts of colors, blues and greens are okay, and the yellows, oranges and reds, darker reds are not so good. So we definitely have an issue with nitrate in the south and southeast. We look at the 2 pie charts then for nitrate in terms of quality. It's about 47% are in an unsatisfactory condition. That's now we're in monitoring stations. So 47% of monitoring stations would have concentrations that are too high. And when we look at the trends in the bottom donut there, we can see that a large proportion of them have, have had an increase. 38% in the red bar there of monitoring stations have shown an increase over the last monitoring cycle. Moving on the right panel then, the phosphorus story is a very different distribution, and this is very much tied into the soil type. The poorly draining soils give rise to these phosphorus issues. So again, looking at the first pie chart, it's a smaller proportion are unsatisfactory, around 29%, and they're scattered in areas where there's these poorly draining soils and also some high population densities because people give rise to phosphorus too. The bottom pie then shows the change. The yellow is the by far the biggest proportion, and that's the no change proportion. So phosphorus is much more stable generally than the nitrate trends which have been increasing over the last while. But we still do have a quarter of phosphorus sites that are increasing in concentrations. And there's a link there at the bottom where you can get some more information on the nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations. Some of the hydromorphology issues, I just put up one slide with some photos to bring to life some of the issues that we have. I'm not going to dwell on this, as I say, but these are kind of the main things. It's drainage, it's channelization, it's sediment, excess fine sediment. Not all sediment is bad, but excess fine sediment can be bad, and erosion of river banks. It's clearance of the riparian zone, and also barriers to migration of fish and passage of sediment. So all of these are changes to the physical habitat which impact on habitat conditions, which then mean that our biology, our invertebrates and our fish can't have a nice environment to live in. So we've looked at the issues that are causing the problems. Now, what are the pressures causing those issues? So what are the activities, the human activities that are giving rise to these excess nutrients and the hydromorphology issues? This is a chart from the draft river basin management plan, and it shows the number of water bodies impacted by each of the pressure types. These are the pressure types given to us by the European Commission for reporting, and that's why they're structured and named in this way and counted in this way, I suppose. So the biggest bar there is agriculture, which in a sense is no surprise given that agriculture is the biggest land use and it's the most widespread, so it impacts the greatest number of water bodies. Hydromorphology then is the second biggest bar, and this is the types of issues that we've just seen on the last slide. And then they're followed, you can see that there's a kind of a grouping there in around 200 water bodies each that are affected by forestry, urban wastewater, urban runoff, domestic wastewater, or septic tanks, as you can see there moving down along. So we've a lot of work to do in the agriculture space. It's worth pointing out too that the hydromorphology problems that we see can come from a number of different sectors. So some of them occur because of maybe agriculture, some of them are because of forestry, and some of them are because of the urban environment. So there are the hydromorphology class, if you like, on this chart is a little bit difficult to pinpoint who's responsible. And it's also worth noting that water bodies, about half of our water bodies have more than one pressure, which is going to need to be resolved before we see the water quality impact improve. So how have those changes in pressures, how do they look over the last two cycles? So this chart shows essentially the same chart of pressures, but now there's two bars for each pressure type. The orangey bar, the orangey red bar is the second cycle, the last river basin management plan bar, and the blue bar is the recent work we've done to characterize the pressures again for the third cycle. So if we look at the first bar then, agriculture has gone up. So we now have about 1,000 water bodies, an extra 200 odd water bodies that are impacted by agriculture. Hydromorphology has also gone up by about 100. And some of this, it must be said, is due to our improvements in our tools and our knowledge in understanding these impacts and then being able to map them. So that's not necessarily all about an increase in that pressure type, more that we're just able to understand it better. On the positive side, urban wastewater has gone down by 83. And then looking at down through the rest of the bars, forestry, for example, is fairly consistent, and there hasn't been a huge amount of change in many of the others down along. So honing in then on the agriculture and the urban wastewater in terms of those pressures and where they are and what needs to happen to fix them. And I know Sinead and Elaine will probably come back in on this later on. So if we look at agriculture first, this map shows, based on the evidence base that I've just talked about in terms of the water quality and where we know the issues are and where we know the pressures are and our understanding of catchments, these are the areas where we need phosphorus measures in blue, and we group together phosphorus and sediment and chemicals actually, because the types of measures that we need are about intercepting the pathway and stopping the runoff, bringing phosphorus and chemicals and sediment overland and into the streams. So those are the blue water bodies that need pathway interception measures. And the types of measures that we're talking about there are riparian zones, buffer zones. It's about maybe engineering some ditches to stop the sediment and the phosphorus moving from a ditch into a stream. It's about breaking the pathway. And those sorts of measures also can have benefits, co-benefits for biodiversity. On the other hand, then, as I showed you in the earlier map, we do have a nitrogen problem in the south and southeast, and those orangey water bodies are the places where we need to reduce the nitrogen leaching. And the types of measures there we're looking at are really stopping the leaching and controlling the losses at source. And those kinds of measures have co-benefits for climate and ammonia. So really where we're trying to get to in the draft of our basin management plan is this mantra of the right measure in the right place. We have tools now, though, also to help prioritize where the action needs to go. So I mentioned we've around 1,000 water bodies now that are impacted by agriculture and that needs these types of pathway interception measures. And the photo there shows what it is we're talking about. This is like a little runoff pathway that is intercepting and bringing all of the flow and the nutrients and the sediment when it rains down into the nearby stream to the left of the photo. And we have maps now to map those. That bottom picture there shows the type of mapping that we now have to pinpoint where these risky areas are in the landscape so that they can be targeted in on for focused pathway interception measures. So when we look at all of the water bodies that are in trouble and we pull out all of these pathways, you can pinpoint around 2,500 kilometers of riverbank that need these types of measures. And now that's about 3% of our entire riverbank network. So we're really starting to be able to get down now and focus where the best bang for buck can be targeted. And these tools are now in use by the Agricultural Sustainability Support and Advice Programme, ASAP, to help work with farmers to target where the measures need to go. Moving on to nitrogen then, we have similar maps targeted that show us where the risky areas are for losing nitrogen. So this is the map on the top right there shows the Blackwater catchment, which is about 3,000 square kilometres in North Cork. Overall, we've about 500 water bodies that need nitrogen reduction measures, those orangey areas in the previous measures map I showed you. And we can hone in now much more closely to those risky areas where the freely draining soils are in the south and southeast. And we can target around 7,000 square kilometres of these highest risk areas to achieve the best bang for buck again. So lots of progress here with the science and bringing the science forward in ways that the sectors can use the tools to really target the effort. So finally then the urban wastewater issues. We have around 200 water bodies where urban wastewater is a significant pressure, as I showed on the previous graph. And the EPA sets priorities for Irish water in where the investment should start. Out of all of there's lots of investment to be made, but the EPA sets priorities, the environmental priorities, at least for Irish water, in where they target the effort. So in 2017, there were 148 priority areas on the list, and that is coming down over time to 97 in 2021. So there is investment going on, and this we can see reflected in the scale of the significant pressures. We are seeing improvement in urban wastewater, albeit that it's not as quick as we would like. The three maps show then some of the key priority areas, and these have come straight from our urban wastewater treatment report. There are 12 areas that don't meet the European standards. There's 34 towns and villages still discharging raw sewage. And there are 42 areas where the investment needs to be prioritized to target the significant pressures to achieve the water quality outcomes that we need. And these maps and data have come from our urban wastewater report, and the links there at the bottom. So there's lots of work needed, and we now have the tools, I would say, to focus the effort. We just need to get on with it. So the last few slides, I just wanted to show you where you can find some information about your local stream. We have a shared website, catchments.ie. And on there, if you go to catchments.ie, there's a toolbar across the top. If you click on maps, in there, you can find the map of Ireland and our mapping system. And along the top toolbar there, you can explore all of the information we have in terms of the status of water quality and also the pressures that are impacting on those waters. And if you are standing beside your local stream in the field and you open up catchments.ie on your mobile phone, the map will zoom to your location. so that you can straight away see what the color of the stream is when you click on the status and risk layer. Or else you could, in the office, then you can also just zoom in on the map using the tools at the bottom right there to zoom into your local area. So that's the mapping feature, but we also have a number of reports up on catchments.ie if you prefer to digest the information that way. So again, along the top toolbar, there's a data button and an areas for action button. So the data button takes you to a page, again, with a map of Ireland, where you can click the catchment of interest. So I've clicked there on the Boyne catchment, or you can just type in Boyne, and up will come our third cycle Barrow catchment report. So in there is all the summary of all of the evidence we have on the Barrow catchment, and there's one of those for each of our 46 catchments. Similarly then, there's work going on by the local authorities water programme in these 190 areas for action. And as the reports are coming available for those areas for action, those reports are going up again on catchments.ie, and you can download an interim report. Not all the work is being completed on all of those areas for action, and so there won't be a report for every area for action just yet, but as they come, they are going up live on catchments.ie. So you can also find out the latest information on your local area for action there on that site. So my final slide then, I just wanted to refer to two public consultations that are open. Park, you mentioned at the start, the draft river basin management plan consultation, and I know it's been a feature of the last few webinars. So there's a link there to the department consultation website. And I know SWAN, you're pulling together some much easier to digest information to help people pull their submissions together too. So that's good. And then the second one I just wanted to reference was the EPA have a consultation out at the moment on the designation of the third cycle heavily modified water bodies. So these are water bodies that have been impacted by physical modifications and get a different kind of objective set for them to recognize that modification. So we have consultation out on that at the moment, which will close at the end of April. And there's information again on catchments.ie and also on the EPA website. So that's it. Thank you very much.
That's wonderful, Jenny. Thank you so much. Just to people at home, if you have a question for any of our speakers, please put them into the Q&A button. Once the speakers are finished with our presentations, we will have time to put some questions to them. So without further ado, I'll go straight over to Elaine McGoff, and Elaine is the Natural Environment Officer for An Taisce. So thank you for coming along, Elaine, and over to you.
Great, thank you, Boric, and thanks, Jenny, for all of those amazing graphs. So I've been asked to briefly comment on the agricultural measures proposed as part of the River Basin Management Plan. Jenny has really nicely outlined the pressures, so I'm going to cut straight to the chase given the limited time. So as Jenny said, agriculture is the biggest pressure on water quality in Ireland. The first thing to highlight is that the River Basin Management Plan relies very heavily on measures that are proposed in the Nitrates Action Programme, the NAP, and the regulations that stem from that. They're one of the key building blocks for the River Basin Management Plan. And An Taisce has done a huge amount of work on the Nitrates Action Programme and has really serious concerns about the efficacy of these to adequately deliver for water quality, which we repeatedly outlined during the consultation period and in bilaterals with the department, but to no avail. So the NAP, the Nitrates Action Programme consultation document, clearly stated that the previous Nitrates Action Programme had failed to protect water quality and linked that directly with the growing dairy herd. That's where Jenny was showing you the map, where in the south and southeast we're seeing clear nitrates pollution issues, and that correlates quite closely with where the most dairy intense farms are. So the problem is that the new NAP overlaps with the majority of the next River Basin Management Plan, which will lead us to the final deadline for achieving Water Framework Directive compliance by 2027. So it's absolutely key that if we want to achieve our water quality objectives, we have very strong measures in place. Now, to give you some examples of why we're concerned about the measures proposed in the Nitrates Action Programme. Firstly, the department commissioned Teagasc to do some modelling on the impact of various agricultural scenarios on nitrate loss, with the view that they would design their policy measures around that to reduce nitrate pollution, which seemed very sensible. part of that modelling demonstrated that the majority of the nitrate lost, up to 62%, was deposited directly by the cattle themselves while they are at pasture, so from cow urine. But despite that, there is no provision to limit that direct deposition or to even account for it. So you could have very densely stocked pieces of land, which we often do, which are absolutely saturated with nitrate by the cows grazing on it, but we have no controls on it. Compliance is another weak point. Compliance with the regulations is acknowledged to be really poor. The department themselves have said that. But the measures proposed in the Nitrates Action Programme don't adequately address this. There's going to be a new National Agricultural Inspection Programme, but there's no timeline for it. And in general, the measures are vague and there's talk of training, etc. But how long before any of that is rolled out? There's no concrete steps. And in regard to fertilizer reduction, I acknowledge that the new Nitrates Action Programme does propose cutting nitrogen by 10 to 15%, which sounds good. But in the Teagasc modelling, they showed that a 20% reduction in fertilizer would only lead to a 7% reduction in nitrogen runoff. Now, there are catchments down in the south and southeast where we need to reduce nitrate runoff by 50%. How will they possibly achieve that? And finally, nitrate management plans. Teagasc have said that nutrient management plans, rather, Teagasc have said that nutrient management plans aren't being implemented in a large number of cases. And it was recognised as being key for reducing nutrient runoff. Despite that, there are few concrete measures in the plan to address this. It's still only required for derogation farms, despite our recommendation that it should be incorporated on all farms. And it's not risk-based, and it doesn't appear to rely on those lovely pollution impact potential maps that Jenny showed. So the Nitrates Action Programme, just to reiterate, the River Basin Management Plan is relying on this. And from our perspective, from my perspective, it's riddled with weaknesses. And there's also conflict between the Nitrates Action Programme and the River Basin Management Plan. For example, when it comes to derogation farms, Ireland secured another nitrates derogation from the European Commission last week. This is essentially a license to stock a higher density of animals and spread more slurry over a land holding. Basically, it allows you to have a higher nitrogen loading on a licensed farm. Now, the environmental assessment for the Nitrates Action Programme said this, and I quote, "For the state to facilitate even greater nitrogen loading to the environment is environmentally unsustainable against the current baseline, and it is recommended that the state does not seek this derogation." Despite that, we sought it and we were granted it last week. So it's important to note that there is no environmental assessment of the granting of these derogation licenses at a national level. Farmers have to tick certain boxes in regard to slurry storage capacity, and they are more regulated. But at no point is there an assessment to see if the catchment they're in can take this extra loading, if it'll compromise the Water Framework Directive objectives or be compliant with other European directives. And this is really interesting because the River Basin Management Plan, the assessment that went with that, highlighted that in terms of compliance with the Habitats Directive, it's essential that there be site-specific appropriate assessments and environmental assessments for any derogation farm stemming from the Nitrates Action Programme. So we called strongly for that throughout the Nitrates Action Programme consultation process, and it has not been incorporated. So you have two pieces of policy here which are in direct conflict. You have the River Basin Management Plan, whose assessment says we need site-specific assessment. You have the NAP, the Nitrates Action Programme, which doesn't even mention that, yet the River Basin Management Plan is relying on the Nitrates Action Programme. So it's very mixed up, and I'd have serious questions about how this can be addressed. And it's our view that site-specific assessments are absolutely essential. And again, as Jenny said, we have lots of progress on the science, and we have the tools now for different sectors to use. But the problem is that I'm not seeing that the sectors are signing up to use these tools. The River Basin Management Plan outlines the needs for targeted measures based on science. It's all very sensible. And the greater use of the pollution impact potential maps to guide the right measures in the right place. There's no evidence of that being used in either the Nitrates Action Programme or in the CAP strategic plan. So it's eminently sensible, but I don't see it in writing. So in summary, In general, I find the agriculture sector of the River Basin Management Plan to be very weak, with a strong reliance on the Nitrates Action Programme and the CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, neither of which are anywhere near strong enough. They are the only really focused measures. The other measures are vague and include things like progressing the development of farm sustainability tools, potentially extending LawPro and ASAP, enhancing compliance, but there's no clear framework to achieve that. So it's really lacking in measures that give me comfort that it's going to achieve what it's setting out to achieve. So to finish up, I just want to say what we would like to see and what we've included, what SWAN have included in the Restore Our Waters campaign. We would like to see a catchment water body based approach with the Water Framework Directive outcome as the objective. So Jenny showed you there, there's 46 catchments. We would love for each of these catchments to be taken and to make a plan for what needs to happen in each of them to achieve our Water Framework Directive aims in a really integrated catchment approach. We think we need Water Framework Directive specific risk assessments for all intensive farms, including derogation farms, through a permitting or licensing system similar to what pigs and poultry have to apply for. And intensification, in particular to derogation stocking rates, should only be permitted if it can be demonstrated that it will not impact on the Water Framework Directive objectives for associated water bodies. And for existing farms deemed to be at risk, because there's bound to be quite a few of those, regulatory, voluntary, or combined measures should be implemented to reverse the pollution impacts, including through herd reductions, with compensatory measures put in place to support this where necessary. And there's going to be certain subcatchments which should be zoned ineligible for certain stocking rates if necessary, based on the catchment carrying capacity. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Elaine. Jenny, do you want to respond to anything that Elaine said, or would you prefer to wait until the end? You're just muted there.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm happy to wait till the end.
Okay.
I suppose, yeah. No, I'll come back in later on. Yeah,
that's fine. Okay, we'll move straight on to wastewater treatment, and Sinead O'Brien is the coordinator for SWAN, and SWAN is the Sustainable Water Network, which is an umbrella body for a number of organisations, including the Irish Wildlife Trust. So over to you, Sinead.
Also have to remind myself about the unmute button. Thanks very much, Pádraig. Yeah, so I'm just going to say a few words about the urban wastewater treatment. Yeah, so just a little bit of revision for the people who are at the Water Framework Directive seminar 2 weeks ago. What does the Water Framework Directive require? And this is in the context of agriculture, but specifically in the context of urban wastewater treatment. So we have to reach good status by 2027. No deterioration is allowed. And to do that, the directive says that additional, and it uses the word supplementary measures, should be implemented to achieve this for water bodies if basic measures don't suffice or aren't going to work. And so in the context of urban wastewater pollution, the urban wastewater treatment directive would be seen as a basic measure. So basic measures, it includes a good few things, but it's like legislation that's already in place. So you see, does what you have in place, is it already working? And then if it's not, you need to zone in on the water bodies and introduce targeted measures. Okay, and then this is courtesy of Jenny. Again, it's just a little revision from the seminar 2 weeks ago. So what exactly does that look like as part of river basin management planning? And what we need to see is, or what's needed by the directive, is targeted water body specific measures for impacted water bodies. So in the context again of urban wastewater treatment, what you'd be looking is how many water bodies are impacted by wastewater, and then for each of those water bodies, what measures are needed. Now, in some ways, urban wastewater pollution is a little bit more straightforward than agriculture. It's not diffuse, so it's not kind of running hither and yon over the land. It's basically mostly coming out of pipes, although it can be sometimes a little bit difficult to even work out where those pipes are. And so you have to delineate and characterize, as Jenny has outlined, and then define the status, and then, sorry, just having problems moving slides. Okay, and so this is the main one here. You need a program of measures, and they need to be targeted to address the impacts on the impacted water bodies. And then a summary of that has to be in the River Basin Management Plan, and then it needs to be monitored. So, is that what we're seeing in the River Basin Management Plan? No, it's not. As Jenny said, there has been improvements and there has been sustained investment. However, of the 210 approximately, I think actually it might be 208 water bodies where wastewater is in impact, not just an impact, but it's the key pressure. There's no specific measures in the plan set out to fix these and to stop this sewage pollution. Now, this is where there's an issue with transparency, because there may very well be measures kind of embedded in the plan to address them, but it's unclear how many of them are going to have measures to address them, because all it says in the plan is that Irish Water's investment plan is going to be, the language is quite vague, but is going to be somewhat aligned with the targets for the River Basin Management Plan. And then if you look at what progress we've made since the last River Basin Management Plan, the last River Basin Management Plan said there was 255 water bodies that were impacted and that they were going to be addressed. And in fact, only, as we saw from Jenny's presentation, only 83 of those have been completed. So that leaves us, I hope the maths are right, with 208 that are still causing problems. And then, as Jenny also said, of those 208, now these are ones that are, they're the main source of pollution, but of those then, which are the top priorities, and they were identified in the EPA's report, 42 of these where the improvements are most urgently needed to prevent pollution. And note, this includes discharges into special areas of conservation, including freshwater pearl mussel rivers. And I mean, I think it's fairly shocking, but Irish Water haven't even provided a clear time frame of how they're going to fix and address those in 2/3 of those 42 water bodies. So what we are recommending is that the Irish Water Investment Plan has to include work to fix the pollution coming from all of these 208 water bodies by 2027, which is the final deadline, bearing in mind that we've had 3 cycles of the River Basin Management Plan, and that that action needs to be done in the context of targeted water body specific actions that are linked to the pressures. And then for other identified wastewater pollution, because I mean, our members see all the time evidence of wastewater pollution, in smaller streams that are not really registering, but are still causing a lot of pollution. So there also needs to be a program of action to fix those. We also need measures to address overflows from combined sewer overflows. So they are not discharges from plants, but discharges from the wider sewer system, especially after heavy rain. And that also has a public health implication, especially as we see more and more people swimming and surfing and canoeing, etc. And as we see in the UK, this is more of a public health recommendation, but we are recommending a pollution alert system for those overflows. And then we need urgent action. This is almost like us saying we want those 208 fixed, but we definitely need, as a matter of urgency, those 42 priority areas that the EPA have identified, including discharges into special areas of conservation. And so really what we're asking for is for the River Basin Management Plan and Irish Water's Investment Plan to be brought into, to be integrated, and this is what should have been done since the Water Framework Directive came into force nearly 20 years ago now, and we're still asking for this. And we need transparency and a gap analysis to show, what is currently in Irish Water's plan and where are the gaps in terms of reaching our Water Framework Directive obligations. And one final comment that I'd like to make is I've mentioned Irish Water a lot, but I think it's very important that we all remember that it's the Irish state and the Department of Housing is the responsible body for water pollution, and in particular for implementing the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, which is more than 20 years old and we're not in compliance with. As we heard from Jenny, there's still 40, maybe 38 now areas where raw sewage is being discharged. There's another 12 areas where there's discharges that have been out of compliance with the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive for, I think it's up to 10 years now. And so we need to see those addressed as an absolute priority, and we need the two systems to be integrated. And just to finish my final point, this is not just Irish Water's problem. It is an issue for the Irish state to prioritise this and to prioritise investment, which is actually quite straightforward in cutting this very significant source of pollution, which is also a public health threat. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Sinead. So once again, just to remind you at home, if you have a question for Jenny or Elaine or Sinead, please put it into the Q&A button. Please don't put it into the chat. It's just easier for me to monitor the questions if it's just in the Q&A. And so maybe I'll go back to you first, Jenny, please. And I'm conscious of the role here of the EPA as kind of the competent scientists in this regard. And there's a lot of politics involved in agriculture and farming. And so I'm not expecting you to answer for the political decisions of the Department of Agriculture, indeed. But particularly around some of the issues Elaine has raised about the nitrates action plan. Can you comment maybe on the EPA's role in that, or any concerns that the EPA might have on the nitrates action plan, and maybe particularly also about the suggestion that I think Elaine was making was about, doing specific assessments on dairy farms at a very, individual level, and licensing of those farms with their carrying capacity and so on.
Thanks, Pádraig. There's a good bit in that. I might start off, though, with the EPA's role in the Nitrates Action Programme. I think that's a good place to get that out first. And you're absolutely right. Our role is to provide the evidence base on water quality to help the policymakers decide on the policy. So, as some of your listeners may know, we sit on the Nitrates Expert Group alongside Teagasc, and Teagasc and ourselves provide the science and the evidence on water quality and agriculture, respectively, to input into the policymakers. So it's the policymakers that decide on the Nitrates Action Programme and whether or not the state applies for derogation and all of those policy issues. So yeah, we've invested a good bit of effort and time, and you could see through the presentation there on the science, on how we can use that science to best target the effort. And we've been calling out for many years now the issues with effectively too many nutrients from agriculture in our catchments, particularly in the south and southeast. It's clear as day we have exceeded the carrying capacity for nitrogen in those catchments in the south and southeast. And the trends are not yet going in the right direction. So there's a lot more action needed generally. We published last June a report on Elaine referred to it earlier, I think, on the scale of the nitrate reductions that are needed to get back to where we need to be environmentally. And we looked at all of the data that we have nationally, and we were able to pull out those catchments in the south and southeast. There's 13 of them where action is needed. And we now have our tools to help the policymakers and the sector target their effort. There's a couple of key points I'd bring out. Compliance is a big one, and Elaine, I agree with you entirely on that. It's very clear that we don't have a good grip on compliance, and indeed the Nitrates Action Programme consultation documents acknowledge that up front. There's more work to be done on the compliance, and I think we will see over the coming years a bit more focus on the farm inspections that the local authorities do, and making those work better for us as a state. Definitely more work to be done there on the compliance. It's very hard to disentangle scientifically the role of non-compliance, derogation, general farming, and the differentiation between the impacts of different farming sectors on water quality, because of the way agriculture is such a mix in our landscape. Our soils are a mix, and we know scientifically the soils drive the outcomes, the water quality outcomes. Our farming is a mix. You know, we don't have whole catchments that are only derogation farmers. We have a mix. So it's very hard to pinpoint and pull out tillage is responsible for this, or dairy is responsible for that, or derogation is responsible for that. But what is very clear is, as a whole, when you look at the sector as a whole, there is significant reductions in emissions of nutrients need to be achieved in order to get back to where we need to be. There's one more point I'd pull out before I stop hogging the floor. And I think it's interesting that it actually came out in both year sets of commentary, Sinead and Elaine, even though you were talking about different subjects. And that is the policy integration. We've been very strong calling out in our State of the Environment report the need for more joined up thinking amongst the policymakers. We have so many ag policies now between the NAP, the CAP, ag climatise, food wise, there's the climate action plan. And really, are they all pulling in the same direction? And are they consistent with the biodiversity plans, the river-based management plans, the climate plans, the flooding plans? We really need, as a state, to get a better grip on integrating our policy and making it sure it's aligned, and that all of the different elements are synergistic rather than antagonistic, and achieving the best possible outcomes in a coherent way for the environment. And I think that's a place the state really needs to progress over the next number of years.
Jenny, do you want to comment on the potential for licensing of dairy farms? Is that something you'd care to mention?
So that issue pops up every now and again. The agency has a licensing role for intensive agriculture for pigs and poultry. We don't have a licensing role in dairy, and our roles and responsibilities in that regard are firmly set out in the legislation. So at the moment, it's only required for us to license pigs and poultry. That's
okay,
all we
so
can
again,
do.
that would be a political decision
that's
to
all we can do. Yeah,
expand that out. I know
back to the policymakers. Yeah.
And just finally, Jenny, if you don't mind, because there's the EPA, I know, is working on land use plan, and I'm wondering, is that an opportunity to bring in some of the coherence that you're talking about between different strategies and plans? Is water getting a good look in that? Do you know?
So I'm only involved personally on the periphery of that. Some of my colleagues are more engaged in it. It's a program that's been led by actually DEC, the Department of Environment and Climate Action, and there's communications in there as well. We're pulling together the evidence base to inform that review at the moment, and it's still in its early stages. But certainly, yeah, I actually have a meeting next week scheduled with my colleagues internally to bring forward the water aspects into that evidential review. But I'd expect that will be a very interesting area over the coming years. There's lots of other countries have gone down this line. New Zealand, for example, has really looked at what land can do and what it can cope with, and trying to bring in those environmental aspects in a coherent way to landscape management. So I think it's a very exciting area for us to explore over the next few years.
Yeah, very good. It seems to be a way forward. Elaine, there was a question there from Charles, I think it was, about whether it's possible to know whether your local farmer is in derogation or not. Is that information in the public domain? Do you know?
Not that I'm aware of it. I think I've been told there's GDPR issues, but Jenny might know more about that than me. But I've never been able to get that information. We know we can get maps showing us generally where the derogation farms are, but not detailed enough to identify them. Okay,
and we've heard about the ASAP program, which is the Agricultural
Sustainability
Advisory
Support and Advice Program.
Very good. So, Elaine, could you tell us a little bit about that? Is that working, or what is that achieving, do you think, or what more needs to be done in that regard?
Yeah, there's the ASAP program that work closely with LawPro, whose acronym I've also forgotten, Local Authority Water
Program.
I thought there's another word in there. They work quite closely together. So what you have in Law Pro, you have catchment scientists, and they go out and walk these certain catchments, the areas for action. They'll go and walk the catchments. They'll see where the problems are, where that picture that Jenny showed you, where you have maybe overland flow going into a stream. They'll highlight those. Then they kind of hand the file over to an ASAP advisor, and they go and talk to the farmers. So they're kind of more on the farming side of things. So I've been told that there's great engagement. I know Jenny said that there's been improvements in some of these areas of further action, but I have yet to see data saying that, that the outcomes, that the scientific outcomes are there. I do believe farmers are interested. I believe farmers do want to engage, but from my perspective, I can't say for definite if it is or if it isn't working until I see the data.
Yeah, that you did mention, Jenny, that there have been improvements in the areas that were identified as priority areas. I think there were 190 of them. Do we know why those improvements have happened? Jenny?
That it's a mix. And it's very difficult to pull it out because, oh, am I on mute still?
No, you're not. No, we're hearing you. Yeah.
No, all right, Grant. Yeah, it's difficult to pin that down. Also, the ASAP and the Law Pro program have only really been up and running for 2, at best 3 years, and part of that was COVID. So they haven't really kicked into full gear, really, in terms of the outcomes that they've been able to achieve. So we'd expect to see better outcomes over the coming years. But yes, there is encouraging improvements. Some of those improvements will be down to all of the other pressures that are also in areas for action. So they weren't only selected because they were agriculture. So some of them will have had urban wastewater treatment plant upgrades. Some of them would have been in forestry areas, and maybe the forestry has become more stable, or there's a mix, and it is very difficult to disentangle. And this will be another of our key messages when we put in our submission to the River Basin Management Plan, is the need for us as a country to get a better handle on the data of what measures are going in where, so that we can then do a critical review of what measures are working and what measures are not working, or where do we need the extra effort. That kind of activity data and the measures data of what's actually happening in the landscape is very difficult to get a handle on.
Yeah. No,
and we also need to remind ourselves that they're all voluntary measures, and there's no one body in charge of it. What we've recommended is there needs to be a nationwide coordinated program of those on-farm measures, in particular for phosphorus, that looks at the catchment specific conditions. But at the moment, we don't have anybody overseeing it. We don't have all that data Jenny's asking for being pulled together in a coherent way. And there's nobody in charge of it, and there's no resources, unless they happen to be in an EIP, or maybe they apply for, agri-environmental scheme, but it's just all very piecemeal.
And Sinead, on the wastewater treatment issue, it seems positively straightforward compared to the agriculture issue. Are we just talking about not stumping up the money for improving these treatment plants? Is it as simple as that?
It's not quite as simple as that, but it almost is. If you speak to Irish Water about it, they'll say that there's issues around planning, and there's a lead-in time, and there aren't enough builders in the country, and so there's all of that as well. But there still needs to be a commitment to investment.
It is a technological issue, though, isn't it? The technology is there to treat the water to a high standard.
Yeah, there is. I would imagine, and Jenny would know more about this than me, I think it becomes trickier when you're talking about identifying where the different sewer overflows are. Irish Water say that a lot of what they inherited, the maps are dodgy and the pipes aren't where they're supposed to be, or etc. But when it comes to the big wastewater treatment plants, it's just a case of the government, stumping up the money and getting on with it. The one thing that rings alarm bells for me is when Irish Water starts talking about, it's the locals protesting and its planning needs to be, fast-tracked, and I have heard that as well. So that's not something that SWAN would be in favour of, to speed things up. But yeah, I think, and I I would like to emphasize again that the finger isn't necessarily being pointed just at Irish Water. It's the Irish state and the Department of Housing that are responsible for this. And, you know, this is, I mean, it's a bit outrageous because the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive is one of our oldest pieces of environmental legislation. It's been knocking around since the 1970s. And the fact that we're still not compliant with it, I mean, it's just an embarrassment, to be honest. So I would love to see a statement from the department saying that this is now a priority for those 208 water bodies to just put an end to that pollution. And especially now with so many people enjoying our water environment. I mean, this is a public health issue. People get sick all the time from going swimming and canoeing and just sort of accept it as kind of like part of your recreational activity. I mean, that just shouldn't be the case. And I know in New Zealand they have, and the Rivers Trust in the UK are starting to look through this lens now of swimmable rivers. So it's not just about our beaches. You should be able to jump into your river and have a swim without getting sick. And most people in Ireland wouldn't dream of it. So yeah, and there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, we have a few lakes as well that aren't swimmable, which is tragic really in the summer. And Sinead, what about septic tanks, particularly obviously that would be more prevalent in more rural and remote areas? Is that a significant issue in terms of compliance and meeting good water quality standards?
Well, I'd say a bit, and then I'll defer to Jenny because Jenny's probably more of an expert on this, but it's not as much of an issue, definitely, but they can be a problem in vulnerable areas, especially high status water bodies. You know, they're just so vulnerable to any kind of interference. And so if you have a malfunctioning septic tank, then, you know, that can suddenly become a serious issue. But our problem as well is that the inspection program is not widespread enough. So there's only 1,000, I think it's been put up now to 1,500 septic tanks being inspected. And even when they are inspected and they're found to be non-compliant, then the follow-up is just so slow. And I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but it's something like 40% of septic tanks that have been inspected, found to be non-compliant, that are still non-compliant. So nothing is being done about it. So it's just pointless having an inspection program when like nothing, there's no action at the end of it. So yeah, I mean, it's, you know, in the greater scheme of things, they're not massive, but there's loads of them out there malfunctioning, causing problems and not being fixed.
Thanks, Sinead. Jenny, do you want to comment on septic tanks?
Yeah, Sinead, you've summed it up fairly well there. It's in the grander scheme of things, when you recall back the chart, the bar chart I showed with the pressures, the septic tanks is way down the list compared to some of the other things. But you're spot on that when you're in a very small stream or you're in a very vulnerable, sensitive ecological area, they can have an impact, absolutely. And the inspection plan and the program is, one thing I would say is that it is targeted, it's a risk assessment, it's risk-based. So the inspections are targeted into areas where we would expect to find the problems. And that is borne out in the high non-compliance rate, as you pointed out. And yes, that follow-up is critical. Now, I suppose one of the positive things is that there is a grant scheme there now where these tanks are found to be defective in high status waters or in areas for action that landholders can get access to. But again, the take up and the implementation of that is all a bit slow.
Thanks for that, Jenny. I mean, Jenny, just before we go, we're going to wrap up in 2 or 3 minutes. But Sinead mentioned there about how, particularly during the COVID lockdowns, a lot of people have been swimming in seas and rivers and so on. And in Dublin, in particular, where I live, we know the wastewater treatment plant hasn't been working. I don't know, has it ever been working properly? And there's stormwater overflows and everything. Is the monitoring program that's done on the bathing waters around the country sufficient to give people assurance that they're swimming in clean water, do you think?
So the Bathing Water Directive and our national bathing water regulations set out quite clearly how the beaches are to be managed during the bathing water season, which is it's the summer months effectively, between June and September. And so during the season, there's a minimum requirement of monthly sampling, but most local authorities, particularly in the Dublin area, would do it way more frequently than that. They're usually up at weekly. And what happens is there's a program, they do their monitoring if there are poor results, there are warnings put up so that the public are warned, and the notices are taken down then when clean samples are recovered to demonstrate that it's safe. So I would say within the bathing water season, the management regime is very good, and the public can have confidence that if they've checked their notices up on the beaches and they've checked beaches.ie for the latest restriction information, that they'll be reasonably safe. Now, what we always say is, as a general rule, no matter where or when you're swimming, if it has been raining heavily, then you need to wait at least 48 hours in order to let that kind of the first flush and the flush through go. So that would be just a standard personal health protection thing you can do, is not to swim for 2 days after it rains. But beyond that, then, yes, within the bathing water season, the system is working fairly well to protect public health. Where the difficulty lies then is outside the season, because over the last couple of years, as most people would know, and Sinead, you referenced it, people are taken to the environment a lot more. There's a lot more sea swimming going on. And so there is a group supporting the department at the moment, the Bathing Water Expert Group, having a look at how to protect bathers' health in winter, given that it's outside the season. So I think we'll probably see more on that over the coming months.
Very good. Elaine?
Yeah, very quickly, a follow-up on that for Jenny. Jenny, is there any bathing water rivers or lakes designated in Ireland? And if not, is there a way to go about doing that? Because a lot of people don't live beside the sea and swim in the rivers and lakes, and they're pretty dangerous too, can be.
So we don't have any designated rivers, but we do have some designated lakes. And there are a number of those, I think it's 12 off the top of my head, I could be wrong there, but it's about that, lakes that are designated. We always would encourage local authorities to take on the rivers as well, although that is, it brings a different dynamic in terms of making sure that the public health is protected. There is a process every year. The local authorities they're required under the directive to put out a wide call for the public to submit ideas and pull in submissions for new areas to be designated. And we regulate the local authorities in their duties under the Bathing Water Directive, and we expect that the local authorities take those submissions seriously and consider them properly, and then they provide a report to us on what they've found. So every year, since I've been involved anyway, we've had new bathing waters designated, which is fantastic. The numbers are slowly creeping up. It's a few every year, new ones that are brought in. Now, bringing in new bathing water brings in resource implications for local authorities, and there's also considerations like toilets and facilities which they will use in their decision making. But certainly, I would encourage anybody listening today who swims somewhere which isn't designated to talk to their local authority about putting forward their views on whether or not they feel it should come into the system.
The
Irish Wildlife Trust can have a competition. Who can first get their local river water designated as a bathing water?
We'll take that as a takeaway action, Sinead. Thanks very much. And with that, we'll bring this webinar to an end. I want to thank Sinead and Jenny and Elaine. Thank you very much for bringing your expertise and your wisdom to this issue. This webinar will be on our YouTube channel shortly. And as I mentioned, you can watch back the previous webinars in this series. Next week, we're going to be talking about biodiversity and water. And I'm really excited myself because we're looking forward to hearing from Dr. Evelyn Merkins, who is the foremost authority in Ireland on the freshwater pearl mussel. So please do tune in to that. And finally, just a word to say, go onto the SWAN website. They have made it very easy to make a submission on the River Basin Management Plan. Sinead has just put the link in the chat there. And please do use the tools that Jenny mentioned earlier to find out what your water quality, your water body is like, what the pressures are, and use that as a way to pressure your local politicians into doing something about it. I think that really is key in moving forward. So thank you very much again, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. So long.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.